Hey folks, welcome back to Integrative Psychonautics. Hope you're doing well out there. So today's video is an exploration of perhaps a little bit of a provocative topic that I think would be interesting to share with you guys as a thought experiment and perhaps get your feedback in the comments. And that is this question of, would you want your psychedelic therapist to be, let's say, familiar with psychedelics themselves? Do you think it's important for psychedelic therapists to have a lot of time logged taking them themselves and understanding how psychedelics impact you? Or would you be okay with a psychedelic therapist who'd only had maybe a couple psychedelic experiences in their lives, and yet they're running a psychedelic session with you? Where's your comfort level? What feels right to you? That's what I want to explore in this video. So if you're interested in the topic, please join me. All right, so a little bit of context here, and then we'll go ahead and kind of unpack some of the points from my point of view. This is really a conversation that I think is highly relevant to where psychedelic therapy is going in terms of the mainstreaming and the scaling and the mass training of therapists who are not historically psychonauts or driven by an interest in psychedelics of their own accord. They're kind of getting on board because they see the potentials, or they want to get trained, or there's economic viability in it for them, whatever their motivation might be. We have a lot of these people who are coming into the psychedelic space right now. And so I think this is an important discussion to have. And I would love to share my own thoughts as someone who has a long personal history with psychedelics, as I'm sure you probably already know if you watch this channel, and as someone who, works more on the underground side of things and is talking to other underground people as well as, above board psychedelic therapists or people in training to be above board for psychedelic therapy. I'm getting different angles on this. And so I'd love to just kind of share my thoughts about this with you and explore it a little bit and see what you think. So the reason I'm bringing this up is I sat in on a psychedelic integration circle of a peer that I just met a couple weeks ago, just locally here in Denver, and had an awesome time. It was a really cool circle, awesome people. He did a fantastic job. And he posed this question. And, I've heard this question posed on, some podcasts. And I think it's an important one to discuss here. And so it got me thinking about it, hearing him, posit this question to the group and hearing the group's replies. And so I thought I would just kind of offer it here on the channel to you, because I know some of you are probably kind of perhaps have a history of psychedelics, familiarity. Others of you are perhaps totally new to this space or just exploring it or curious about psychedelics. You haven't even taken them yet, or perhaps you're kind of within that first 50 psychedelic experiences, like kind of familiar, but still kind of new. And so I think this would be relevant for a lot of you. I think this is an interesting question. So I'd love to kind of explore it from a couple different angles here. Maybe we'll start with kind of one angle that I often hear put on this and kind of look at that. And then we'll kind of unpack my own personal thoughts about this. So in this discussion, what we hear a lot is something along the lines of a parallel or comparison made to pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical prescription, and the kind of relevance of taking pharmaceuticals as a therapist and a prescriber already, right? So the kind of common reply or metaphor is something like this. Well, psychiatrists already prescribe meds. They prescribe SSRIs and benzos, et cetera, et cetera. And most of them aren't necessarily taking these medications themselves either. And yet they seem to do a decent job of prescribing and managing that. So why would it be any different with psychedelics, right? Now, I think this question in and of itself is an interesting ethics question, right? I could see a strong case made for the importance of all psychiatrists taking the medications that they're going to be prescribing to others, at least for a week or two, and understanding what that feels like in their own body and in their own lived experience, so that they have a grounded understanding of what this is like from the inside and not just from the outside, from a analytical, kind of big data doctor's perspective on it. I can really, really understand that argument. The other side of the coin, though, is, of course, if we had to require, therapists, psychiatrists, even coaches or hypnotherapists, someone like myself, if we had to require people to have gone through the very thing that they're helping to treat all the time, A, the numbers would be way lower. B, not everyone would have successfully traversed their issue in time to be able to be functional, to be able to serve others, right? So I can see an argument for why this becomes a little bit kind of absurd, right? So I can see the argument there as well. But basically, the, I don't see psychedelics, in the same light. I think this is the intellectually honest answer here is that, something like an SSRI or a benzo or a lot of these other prescription medications, they're different classes of drugs with different neuropharmacology. And quite frankly, a lot of them are a lot more linear and predictable in how they're going to impact somebody and their kind of dose response curve and what a person's nervous system is going to do with the presence of these meds, as far as I know, caveat being that I haven't, been medicated throughout my life. So I could be wrong about that. But as far as I understand, most other drugs, even if we're looking at like other street drugs, are more predictable in character and in response than psychedelics on average. I think psychedelics are a wild card. They are a roll of the dice. There is chaos built in to the psychedelic experience that you just don't see as a feature in a lot of other medications, as far as I understand. So for me, there is a distinct difference here. I wanted to explore some of these other ideas and other angles, but I think, if I was going to just kind of summarize my own view here, and then we'll get into unpacking it. From my point of view, I absolutely think a psychedelic therapist should be well-versed in psychedelics. They should be intimately familiar with them. It's my own feeling about this. And I'll explain why in depth. But yeah, I don't think this is the same as prescribing someone meds. And I do think you really need to know, especially if you're working with someone's nervous system while they're on a psychedelic, especially if it's a classical psychedelic where there's a high risk of abreaction, negative emotion, sudden swings in character or tone of the journey. You really need to understand what that feels like and what that is. So let me explain a bit more about why I have this view, and then we'll kind of wrap the video, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it too. So I think it's important to note up front that there's a big difference, from my point of view at least, between a lot of meds and psychedelics, in that most meds generally are impacting people in some sort of a deactivating way, right? So whether we're looking at, SSRIs or other antidepressants, or we're looking at benzos, even something like Adderall, which is a stimulant for ADHD. If the person properly has ADHD and they take a stimulant, that also has a deactivating effect in the sense of focusing, calming, centering the person, rather than letting them be in the full extremes of their ADHD experience, right? So generally speaking, most meds that we see are meant to kind of soothe, center, focus, calm, deactivate, right? I think it's really important to understand, and a lot of people get confused about this because psychedelics are nuanced and multifaceted and complex, and it's easy to kind of get caught up in certain aspects and associations. But I think it's important to understand that psychedelics are fundamentally drugs that make you more sensitive. They're activating. They make you more sensitive to what's happening inside yourself, to the contents of your own unconscious mind, to your environment around you, which is why, of course, set and setting is so key, right? They make you more sensitive. They are activating. They are also, by their very nature, more chaotic, right? I'm sure we've all seen the famous picture of the kind of two circles with the different like brain, circuit connections of a person in a normal default state of consciousness and a person high in psilocybin. And the amount of connections on psilocybin are just manyfold, much more, right? The psychedelic brain is chaotic. And I don't mean that in some sort of like scary, evil implication of the word. I just mean that there's more complexity in more ways that our thoughts and our, kind of psychosomatic processes could go. There's more divergent thinking. There's more fluidity and flexibility, which is a feature, not a bug. It's an important part of how these help to heal. But the other side of that is they're less predictable, they're less linear, they're less obvious in terms of how they impact us. So when I talk to people who are new to psychedelics, and I remember when I was new to psychedelics, this is something I didn't really understand. And this is something you'll often see, which is that people who are new to psychedelics don't get, they make you more sensitive and they are complex in how they show up in the nervous system, right? So very important to wrap our heads around that first, right? So with that said, there are some other things to understand here about psychedelics, right? So another thing is that because they are complex, right? There's a wider variety, there's a wider spectrum of types of experiences you can have with psychedelics, right? And because of that, it's really important to be able to really understand the kind of breadth and scope and depth of types of experiences that a client might go into if you're running a psychedelic session, so that you can really intuit and meet and support them with wherever their system goes, right? This is part of the art of sitting, or part of the art of guiding or doing psychedelic therapy. And so, if a psychedelic therapist only has 5 journeys under their belt, they've never had a frightening, terrifying, bad trip experience, or they've never had a non-duality ego death all one experience, or they've never had these kinds of some of these in between states that are really kind of archetypal, right? So they've never had a processing the grief of the world experience, or these kinds of things. These are places you want to be familiar with, so that you know how to meet others if that's where they land, right? This is an important part of psychedelic work, is really being able to match the complexity of the experience with your own skill set, in my personal opinion. This is not a simple one size fits all, give a dose, hang out with a person. There's way more to it, right? And so for me, this is another reason why therapists need to really be logging their own hours with these medicines to get familiar with the states, right? Another thing that's really important to get familiar with is how wide open and how sensitive and how impressionable psychedelics make you, right? So we are, especially at certain points in the journey, especially towards the beginning and the middle, so the beginning and the peak, we are very impressionable, right? And our unconscious mind can really take in things so easily. And it's important to understand that, so that we're related to properly in that state. So if a therapist is, for example, the classic way that a therapist is trained, right, is to be kind of more of like a flat, non-personal, non-intimate sounding board of projection and of information coming from the client, where the therapist actually is very reserved and contained and not giving a lot of themselves back. This can often even look like a very flat face, so like not a non-emotional, non-responsive, low affect kind of expression on the face, right? So imagine a therapist like that, and they've taken psychedelics like 2 or 3 times. They're running psychedelic therapy sessions, and there's a person who feels deeply insecure and uncomfortable and disconnected and needs assurance and support. This therapist is sober, and this person is kind of looking to the therapist unconsciously. Let's say they don't even speak up from a place of, hey, this is what I need. I'm feeling anxious. I need support and connection. And the therapist does not reflect that sense of needing that, that person isn't met with warmth or attunement or presence or safety. That could really be injurious to the person's sense of connectedness and safety, and that could add to their attachment wound, right? So this is a very real example of where you need to understand the depth and the complexity and the vulnerability and the sensitivity and the impressionability, right? It's really easy, for example, also for therapists to say something, and from a hypnosis perspective, there's what's called embedded commands. So this is where we kind of can slip in like ideas or suggestions or commands in our language without realizing it, with just the way we speak or our sentences. And this is something hypnotherapists use, intentionally and on purpose, to kind of embed suggestions and seed ideas to the unconscious mind. It's something I don't do a lot of these days, but it's something I'm trained in to do as a hypnotherapist, right? A lot of straight up classic, therapists don't know about embedded commands. They don't know that's a thing. And they don't really stop to think about how there can be all kinds of suggestions embedded in language, and they could just be being themselves, being a normal person, and not realize that as they're doing that, they're creating suggestions, and the psychedelic client's mind is wide open to these suggestions and could easily internalize them, right? Same thing with like rationalizations or being a little dismissive of this thing or that thing. Client says something and they're kind of maybe being a little subtle about what they're saying, and because they're high on psychedelics, and the therapist, like is a little dismissive of it, and maybe in a sober therapy session that might kind of work, but in a psychedelic session that could really, again, really not work. So there's a level of sensitivity and impressionability here that we have to kind of hold sacred. We have to take really seriously and hold as like, oh, I'm reaching potentially with my interaction deep into this person's nervous system, deep into their kind of the core of how their whole operating system works. And I need to be very sensitive, about that and not be a bull in a china shop, essentially, right? So this is another reason why I think therapists really should be taking these medicines themselves and logging hours, feeling what it feels like to feel that wide open and vulnerable. Another reason would be getting a feel for the kind of divergent thinking patterns that psychedelics tend to present, right? So it's one thing from the outside to see a client and their attention, say they're on MDMA and their attention's all over the place because they're on an amphetamine, and they're kind of like, maybe they have a little bit of ADHD already, and they're kind of like, their attention's just fragmented in like 5 different places in the course of a minute, right? Or someone's on psilocybin or LSD and they're, the fluidity of thought is like you're getting just the little tops of the waves. You're not catching everything moving underneath the surface for that person. And so it sounds really disjointed and complex and confusing and incoherent. It's another thing entirely to be inside of that experience and understand that sometimes you're processing at a somatic, feeling, emotional level at a speed that your verbal, cognitive, brain is not keeping up with. And that there's often a very amazing arc of intelligence through what people are experiencing. But we just, if you don't know how to listen and think and see in that way, it can really look pathological. If someone's if a therapist is in a pathological mindset framework where they're trying to understand what someone's processing through this lens of pathology, right? So this is another reason, I think it's important to be familiar with that kind of wide open, loose, divergent thinking. It's a unique mind space, right? Another reason is really, honestly, is that I think psychedelics really show you the whole kind of deep fractal, if you want to think of it that way, or the deep structure, if you want to think of it that way, of your own mind, your own psyche, your own nervous system, your own imprints, your personal history, your projections, deeper, subtler layers of fears, needs, insecurities, desires. If you take psychedelics long enough and really use it in an exploratory fashion, you'll really start to unpack the whole understanding of the structure of your character, your personality, your deep system, how that connects to your spiritual self, etc. Right? And everyone's structure is a little unique to their nervous system. Everyone's structure is different, right? But I think it's super important to learn your own structure so that you can be self-aware enough to be aware of yourself and know much more sensitively when you're projecting on others, for example, or when you are, importing your map of values and understanding, and again, projecting them onto them or onto the situation. In other words, what I'm saying here is I think therapists really should, if they're going to be administering psychedelics, should be taking these substances themselves to be doing their own deep work on themselves to deepen and strengthen their self-awareness, right? So obviously, as part of the process of becoming a therapist, therapists get their own therapy usually, not always. And there are therapists out there who really haven't received therapy, and that's a whole other scary proposition, honestly. But any therapist who's like really serious about it generally, and a lot of therapists get into therapy because they need therapy themselves, right? And so a lot of them go through a fair amount of therapy, but it's in this standard psychotherapy model. And so they may be really intimately aware of certain aspects of their own pathology or certain core wounds or core beliefs, these kinds of things, but they may not understand like the whole deep structure of themselves, right? And this is something psychedelics, I think, really point us towards. And I think it's deeply valuable to know if you're going to be serving others or helping others, right? We need to know ourselves. We need to know our biases. We need to know kind of the whole shape of who we are and take that into account, how that's impacting others, right? So another reason, my last, thinking here, my last piece is that attunement is a key piece of, therapeutic support, healing, working with people, right? We need to be able to really understand and get clear and create an experience of connection, between the whatever therapist, or in my case as a coach or a hypnotherapist, and the person, using the medicine. And if the person using the medicine, again, is going into these interesting corners of their own being, or these new novel thoughts, or these kind of different experiences that the medicine can provoke, I really think it's important for, therapists to have that experience so that they can attune to these experiences better, so that they're not projecting on them, misreading them, so that they're not, just missing the nuance there. Sometimes, a client will say something to me kind of casually on the back end of a sentence. They'll add this whole other little piece of information, and maybe for them it feels like they're giving a little context to me, but they may say something in that little kind of throwaway part of the sentence that's actually like huge or deep or profound. And often I'll stop clients and go, hold up, can we talk about that thing you just said? That's important. And that's the kind of stuff that I think, if a psychedelic therapist doesn't have familiarity with these substances and where they can take you, it's easy to kind of just gloss over that stuff and not really take note of these little kind of cues and sub communications that the client may be offering you that may be valuable content about what they're experiencing, where they're really at. So I think all of that's so better informed by actually taking these medicines. And for me, there's a sense that I personally would not want to be served by someone, in a medicine session who hadn't had extensive experience with the medicines themselves, who wasn't intimately familiar with their own relationship to the medicine, right? Who wasn't intimately familiar with, the different mind states and layers of experience that get unpacked, right? It would be so hard. I would feel like the likelihood of them understanding me is so much lower. So I just want to kind of offer that, that's my personal opinion and perspective on this. But there's bias in that, right? I've been doing psychedelics for most of my adult life. So clearly I value them, right? Clearly they're important to me. Clearly they shape my worldview in a really deep and significant way. So, I'm totally biased on this. So I would love to just kind of bounce it off you guys here. What do you feel? Would you feel comfortable with a psychedelic therapist who doesn't have a whole lot of firsthand experience with psychedelics? Do you feel like that's important to you? Or do you feel like if they're a competent therapist in general, that's good enough and they've been trained in these medicines and that'll be okay and that'll be good? Where do you stand with this? What feels right to you? I think this is an important thing for us to be thinking about, as the mainstreaming and the legalization of psychedelics continues forward, because surely there will be all kinds of clinics popping up. There will be all kinds of opportunities. There will probably be, psychedelic therapists embedded into hospitals and health networks and all the stuff, right? And surely a lot of these people will have done, trainings, but the trainings may only last a few days, right? And these people may just be getting kind of like checking off the skill off their skill set list so that they can kind of have some familiarity, in case it's needed, in their work. And so these may not be specialists or people who deeply know about these substances and the way they interact with the nervous system. So this is a thing. This is a thing for you to think about if you end up wanting to do psychedelic therapy, down the line. Or if it's available to you, what is that quality of care like? And does that matter to you? So anyways, thought I'd put that out there. I'd love to know what you think. I think it's a juicy question. It's a juicy topic. Now you know my thoughts on it, but again, I'm just one person. I'm biased in a lot of different ways here. So yeah, let's have a conversation about it. Leave a comment down below and I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.